Now that you've seen the external structures of the heart, we're going to look at the internal structures. So let's start with a drop of blood that is coming from the systemic circuit that is low in oxygen and needs to pick it up. So first, it will come through the superior vena cava and it will go into the right atrium. You'll notice that I've cut the right atrium so we can actually separate the hearts, or the halves of the heart. So where my probe is, this is the right atrium, and the blood would flow from the right atrium into the right ventricle. And one of the things I want you to notice is that there's a pretty thin myocardial wall right here, or cardiac muscle wall, and then there's this really, really large amount of myocardium right here, and then there's a thicker portion over here. The left side of the heart has a thicker myocardial wall because it's responsible for pumping the blood to every extremity in your body, where the right side of the heart is responsible for pumping blood to this pulmonary circuit, which the lungs surround the heart on the left and the right, so it doesn't have to pump very far. So to get from the right atrium, when there is enough pressure, the blood starts to drain into the left atrium. And when the pressure in the left atrium starts to build, it will not flow back into the atria from the ventricle because of this thing called a valve. Now, because this valve is between the atrium and the ventricle, the technical name for it is the right atrioventricular valve, or the right AV valve. And we also call this the tricuspid valve because these little flaps, there are technically 3 of them around this region. Now, once the deoxygenated blood gets into the ventricle, it is going to pump from the right ventricle through the pulmonary trunk into the lungs. Now, this side of the heart, because of how much muscle is over here, makes it very difficult to see where that is going. So I'm going to close this back up to show you that that blood would go through the semilunar valve, which this would be the pulmonary semilunar valve, goes through the pulmonary trunk. So I'm going to put my probe in the pulmonary trunk, and I am actually going to sort of wiggle this into the ventricle so you can see where it actually goes. Now, it may be difficult to see, I'm going to try to hold it up, that the probe is coming out right here. This is where the right ventricle, when it contracts, will pump blood through the pulmonary trunk, and the valve that prevents the backflow, again, is the pulmonary semilunar valve. Then that blood is going to travel to the lungs, pick up oxygen, drop off that carbon dioxide. It will come back through the pulmonary vein, which is this guy right here. If I put my probe in that particular opening, you will notice that it comes directly into the left atrium, and from the left atrium, it is going to go into the left ventricle, which the valve that separates the left atrium from the left ventricle, the technical name is the left atrioventricular valve, or the left AV valve. This also gets the name bicuspid because it's got 2 flaps to it instead of 3, and it is also referred to as the mitral valve. So once the blood comes into the left ventricle, the pressure is going to build, the valve prevents backflow, and then that blood is going to pump through this region here all the way up, and I've cut through it, but this little flap right here, That was the semilunar valve that goes into the aorta. This would be the aortic semilunar valve, and the blood would travel into the aorta and out the different vessels depending on where the blood is actually going. So the other structures that I wanted to point out to you are these really fascinating cords. It's basically tendon type material, and this is referred to as the chordae tendineae. This is what actually holds the valves in place and allows them to do their job. And where they connect, these little areas are called papillary muscle. Basically, it is just a little protrusion that they connect to. And these cords are what are controlling the valves. So again, blood is going to come back into the right atrium, goes through the right atrioventricular valve or the tricuspid into the right ventricle. Then it will pump from the right ventricle through the pulmonary semilunar valve into the pulmonary trunk, goes to the lungs, picks up oxygen, comes back through the pulmonary vein to the left atrium. Then from the left atrium, it goes through the left atrioventricular valve or bicuspid or mitral valve into the left ventricle. Then the left ventricle will pump the blood through the aortic semilunar valve into the aorta and out to the systemic circuit.